Good evening. I'm Tony Marks. I'm the president of the New York Public Library, and it is my honor to welcome you to the opening night of the new season of Live, and to welcome back to the New York Public Library the great Salman Rushdie. Salman's works both communicate and embody a powerful message that storytelling is fundamental to our shared humanity. And Salman has shown us that the response of a great writer, when told to be silent, is to speak even more profoundly. Just in Tuesday's New York Times, and I quote, he's talking about the standing up for literature, which encouraged understanding, sympathy, and identification with people not like oneself, at a time when the world was pushing everyone in the opposite direction toward narrowness, bigotry, tribalism, cultism, and war. Those days are not over. If a writer has the courage to tell the stories amidst the discomfort of even mortal danger, then we as a society have a duty to preserve those stories and to protect our writers. Free speech demands free access to ideas, and we here at the library, at America's greatest public library, are committed to that ideal. Tonight's event is free, and we are grateful to the family and friends of the late Richard B. Salman for making this evening possible. The New York Public Library made some news this morning. You may have seen it. We changed our plan for the renovation of this building so that we can ensure that almost every book currently here, other than those digitized and available already instantly, will remain here on site. The trustees, the library, took this action with the generosity of Abby and Howard Milstein because we understand that a democracy rests upon an informed citizenry and rests upon a treasure trove, as this library is, to inform the construction of new ideas that can guide us. And as we envision this magnificent building in its second century, we will be opening up more public spaces in this building, and we will be encouraging more study, more scholarship, and more conversation. We are inspired by the works of Salman Rushdie, who wrote in a piece entitled "The General" the following: "Literature is the one place in any society where within the secrecy of our own heads we can hear voices talking about everything in every possible way. We, all of us, readers and writers and citizens and godmen, need that little unimportant-looking room. We do need to call it sacred, but we do need to remember that it is necessary. Wherever in the world the little room of literature has been closed, sooner or later, the walls have come tumbling down. This institution is that set of rooms, Some of it not so little, more grand. Some of it less grand in the poorest neighborhoods of New York, but all dedicated to that vision that Salman Rushdie speaks to and embodies. It is the purpose of literature to encourage mutual understanding, and it is the purpose of the library to provide welcoming spaces for us to tell our stories and to listen to the stories of others and to gain respect for others. We have then the honor and the privilege tonight to listen to one of the world's greatest living storytellers, and I'm proud to say, one of the library's own lions. Salman Rushdie, welcome back to Live at NYPL, and we are joined, of course, by the great impresario Paul Holdengräber, who will be helping guide us in a fascinating discussion. Welcome to the New York Public Library.
Thank you very much. Your seat is right in the middle. Good evening. Thank you very much, Tony Marks, for these warm remarks. And thank you, Salman Rushdie, for being with us here at the New York Public Library tonight. For the past few years, I've been asking my guests to, instead of giving me a long biography of their accomplishments, which are many, to provide me with 7 words that might define them or not at all. A haiku of sorts, or if we want to be very contemporary, a tweet. So I asked Salman Rushdie yesterday for these words, and he said 7 words, and not surprisingly, he gave me a few more. These were his words. I don't know if they're in any particular order. That might be an interesting subject in and of itself. First word is books. The second word is movies, friendship. The other F word, in parentheses, Fatwa. In parentheses, 2 boys. Parentheses, 3 cities. And 4 wives. Salman Rushdie. It's a real pleasure, Salman, to have you here at the New York Public Library. Let's begin, if we could, with a picture. And this picture inspired in me the following quotation from Edwidge Danticat in her book called Create Dangerously. She says, "Create dangerously for people who read dangerously. This is what I've always thought it meant to be a writer. Writing, knowing in part that no matter how trivial your words may seem, someday, somewhere, someone may risk his or her life to read them." And here we have a picture of a bookstore, and you yourself created dangerously, and people risked their lives to sell your books, to edit them, to read them. Here we have the Satanic Verses next to Darwin. I'm wondering whether you could comment on this moment when you created dangerously and it had such a deep effect, an effect that you might not even have known it would have.
Well, I'm not sure that dangerously always, in this literary sense, necessarily means to create physical danger. I mean, I think, I don't know exactly what Edwidge was intending in that, but I feel that art, the art that I most admire anyway, is dangerous in another sense, in the sense that it goes to the edge. You know, and I think if what you want is to, in some way, do something new, if you want to, in some way, increase by even a little bit what is possible for people to imagine, what is possible for people to know, and therefore, in the end, what is possible for people to be, you have to go to the edge and push outwards. That's dangerous. You can fall off the edge, make a fool of yourself. It's artistically dangerous, not necessarily physically dangerous. But I think, I've always thought that great art is created at the edge and never in the middle. You don't sit in the safe middle ground and create great art. You go to the edges. And it's over and over again, not just in literature. You see this. You see the Impressionists being derided for not being able to paint properly.
Salon des Refusés.
Yeah, I mean, the term Impressionism was an insult at the time. It said all they could do was give a sort of impression of what things looked like because they couldn't really paint them. You know, and now
things have changed slightly.
Now there they are as the cornerstone of every great museum collection. But that's what I mean about danger. They go to an edge and they push outwards. You know, and that's what I think of as artistic danger. And then, unfortunately, with the Satanic Verses, it turned into something more tangible as danger. And one of the things, I've been seeing this picture of the book in a bookstore window that I would like to just pay tribute to is the way in which booksellers held their ground in this matter. You know, because I always thought that the front line of this attack was not me, it was the bookstore. And people in I've had so many letters from those days from people running bookstores around the country saying, not just talking about bombs and etc., but people coming in on an almost daily basis and threatening them, threatening the employees who were stocking the books, and that they responded by putting it in the window. You know, that principled and courageous act of American, European, international booksellers was crucial to the act of defending this book. And I mean, I think those were the bravest people, you know, and I'm happy to be able to recognize that. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it's a... From your archives happen to be at Emory University, and Thomas Jenkins, Executive Director of Academic Initiatives at Emory University, who's here in the audience, somewhere there.
I see him. It's over there.
There. I've had the pleasure of speaking with him many times, and he gave us some images, provided us a large archive of your archive for me to go through, which was a great pleasure. And I found the following image, which I'd like us to pull up, of 1989, and I'd like you to read it. So to read your own archive here for us, and the image should be there. You might be able to make it out.
Well, it's my handwriting, so...
You will.
If I can't read it, nobody can. You know, I have a handwriting like a drunken dentist, so... But, you know, it's very... One of the strange things about all my papers having been so beautifully organized and filed at Emory is that I keep finding... I mean, this, for instance, is a page that I'd completely forgotten I'd written. But during the course of this week, when people have been asking me about writing this book, I've said, you know, that I always thought I would, but I just didn't know when, or indeed if I would survive to write it, but I always had it in mind to write this book. And this is a piece of paper that comes from the 12th of June, it's dated 12th of June 1989, so this is February, March, April, 4 months more or less since the Fatwa, that's one of the worst moments of my life. And I find myself talking to myself about a book that I might write about it.
And not knowing if you will survive to write it, and not knowing whether if you write it, you will indeed publish it.
Yeah, not knowing anything. I mean, I was just in this storm. And it goes like this: the idea of a Rousseau-esque confession. When I write my own story, I must do so with absolute freedom, not in fear of my life. Freedom is always a thing we take, it is never given. So I must set aside all contemplation of danger, except insofar as it is a part of my story. Must write as if I were safe, otherwise all would be useless. I may not publish what I write, but that's another matter. Even Diderot took such decisions on occasion. I must be conscious that there are many millions upon millions of human beings for whom my name has become a synonym for wickedness, worthlessness, and evil. No doubt these people will see my book as a pathetic attempt at justifying the unjustifiable, which is actually a phrase from the Satanic Verses. I can only hope that some of these readers may come to appreciate that I have at the very least written honestly and in good faith. How does a man recover from mass hatred? By remembering that he is and has been also loved. So, I have no memory of writing that. That's not bad.
It's not bad. It's not bad at all. And you place yourself in a tradition, and I'm curious about it. The Rousseauistic tradition of confessions. You mentioned Rousseau, and you also mentioned Diderot. And I'd like you to explore a little bit.
Well, I mean, one of the things I did in those early months was to really very carefully reread the writers of the French Enlightenment. You know, so I found myself wanting to refresh my long ago memory of Rousseau and Montesquieu and Diderot and so on. And along with those writers, you know, the famous English language writers on this subject, John Stuart Mill, and you know, John Stuart Mill's On Liberty was a book that I found myself reading again and again. And well, two things came out of that. One was when Rousseau wrote his Confessions, which may be the first example of the modern autobiography. His approach to it was very simple. His approach to it was tell the truth. You know, try and tell as much truth as you can. And that may upset some people, in which case it's going to upset some people. But don't write the book if you're not going to tell the truth. Nobody's making you write the book. There's no obligation on you to write the book. If you're going to write the book, tell the truth. The end. You know, and I thought that, as a guiding principle, was a good one. The other thing that I learned from those writers, les Lumières, as the French call them, the writers of the Enlightenment, was that they understood very clearly that their battle, the battle for free expression, the battle for the freedom of speech, was not a battle against the state. It was a battle against the church. That was an age in which the church, with its inquisitions and anathemas and excommunications and so on, had enormous power to try and restrict what people might say and not say, and how they might say it and not say it. The how is almost as important as the what. You know? And they knew, those writers, that if they were going to create a world in which people could speak their mind freely, that the force they had to defeat was the Catholic Church. And therefore, they decided to use blasphemy as a deliberate weapon, deliberately to go up against the Church's limiting points. So when Diderot writes his great book, The Nun, for example, La Religieuse, he's deliberately blaspheming. He knows he's doing it, and he's doing it because he wants to tell the church, you can't tell me when to stop talking. You know? Now, the point about that extraordinary group of writers is that they won a great victory on the behalf of all of us. You know, the modern idea of freedom of speech comes from the French Enlightenment. The American Constitution comes from the French Enlightenment. You know, Tom Paine over there, colossally influenced by their ideas, came back here and brought those ideas back to this country. So the reason why America is the country it is, the reason why the First Amendment exists, is because of the victories of the French Enlightenment. We live in the aftermath of their courage. You know? And it seemed to me that when I was young, you know, I'm a child of the 60s, we weren't thinking about religious fundamentalism. You know, we were thinking about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and the Vietnam War, and the civil rights movement, and the feminist movement. We were not thinking about God. And in fact, if you had asked us at that time whether we thought that religion would return to being a major force, political force in world history, we would have thought, you know, you're ridiculous. It's a ridiculous idea. Of course not. That's done with, you know. And
little did you know.
Little did we know, or else we turned our eyes away. You know, maybe it's our fault. 60s were a stupid time. And that may have been one of their greatest stupidities, that we didn't see what was going to come. But then, you know, so we found ourselves thinking that this was a war that had been won. We didn't have to fight this war anymore. And then I discovered that yes, we did. You know, another religion, younger, fiercer, you know, with the same structures of excommunication, anathema, burning at the stake, all that stuff, you know, comes at the idea of freedom in the same way. And it's up to another group of people to try and stand up against it.
What interests me also about Rousseau as an example is the voice is so distinctive from yours. I mean, at the beginning of the Confessions, he talks about an autobiography like no one has done before and no one will do after. At the beginning of the Rêverie, which I particularly love, he says, "Me voici donc seul sur la terre. Here I am alone on earth with nobody but myself."
Yes, he was a modest man, Rousseau.
You, on the contrary, as it were, choose a very different kind of voice. And it's a voice I would like to ask you about, because I think it permeates your memoir now, and it is the choice, the very deliberate choice you make of the third person.
Yeah.
And you've said a number of things about it, and I'm just curious how you managed to sustain it and why you started it in the first place.
Well, I started it because when I started writing this book, I wasn't writing it in the third person. I started writing it, as anybody would, as a first-person narrative. I just didn't like it. I didn't like it. It felt whiny and self-regarding. Me, me, me. This happened to me. I was upset. They said this about me. I thought, you know, shut up. That's what it made me feel. It made me feel, you know, stop it. It's just too much me. It's awful in an autobiography to worry about the fact that there's too much me. I understand.
Yes.
It's kind of silly.
I mean, it is autobiography.
Yeah. But then I thought, there was something about the note of it, the tone of it. It may not have upset another writer, but it upset me. And so then there was a day when I just thought, let me see what happens if I switch, as if I were writing about someone else. If I switch into the third person. Because there was a lot of me that felt that I was writing about someone else. That the I that I was then, which is after all 23 years ago, is not the I that I am now. I mean, I think that also, for instance, about the I that wrote Midnight's Children. You know, I mean, when I started writing Midnight's Children, I was 27, 28. That's not who I now am. You know, I mean, I obviously feel a connection to that individual, but
as you do a connection to this,
yes,
very strongly.
But there was I knew that that person, that 41-year-old person, self, you know, that to whom this happened, and who feared that he would never see his 42nd birthday, is not the same person as somebody sitting here who's 65 years old, you know, and who has come through all this. I also felt that it was a moment at which the question of my identity became very problematic, you know, because at that moment there were so many people with different agendas making up versions of me. You know, there were Salman Rushdies walking around who seemed to me to bear very little relationship to me. You know, and so anyway, I felt that my relationship to that person was kind of rather fractured and problematic. And putting it in the third person and being able to look at that objectively rather than subjectively became a sort of open sesame moment when I tried to do it. I thought, oh, this, you know, this works. I could do this. I could do, you know, and it was just that. It was a technical decision. It was the thing that allowed me to tell the story in the way I wanted to tell it.
And a technical decision that has huge implications, in part because the self, as you said before, that existed prior changed so much to the self that was writing now,
yes.
But even more so than the normal process of aging that happens to all of us. It happened because there was a before and an after the fatwa, and that was the decisive moment that changed everything.
There's this kind of traumatic moment, you know, which is a colossal rupture in a human life, you know, and I was having to deal with when I wrote that thing, which I'm rather surprised at how sane it sounds. Wasn't feeling,
it feels like it was, the sanity was in part begotten to you by the sustenance literature offered you.
Yes. As I say, I was reading this stuff. I was reading these writers who had stood up for the values that I was now needing to stand up for, and also needing to defend, you know. And also I was very inspired, and I thought a lot about the history of literary persecution. You know, I mean, after all, I'm scarcely the first writer to be given a hard time.
You mention it in the book. You mention those writers. Who were they in particular that you were looking for?
Well, you know, of contemporary writers, you know, I mean, I thought of Jean Genet writing his masterpieces in prison, you know.
He felt, by the way, that when he got out of prison, he was less able to write.
Yeah, yeah. I thought of Dostoevsky facing a firing squad. And if you know, I thought of Osip Mandelstam going up against Stalin, you know, or Lorca going up against Franco and the Phalange, you know, and I thought of the poet Ovid being exiled by Augustus Caesar and having his life ruined, you know. I thought this is the history of literature. You know, some of the very, very, very greatest writers have had their lives ruined by power, and yet have not surrendered. And I thought, okay, if it's your turn, you know, you have to try and be worthy of that lineage. You know, you can't crumble when all the people you admire most, you know, did not. And I drew a lot of strength from that, from the history of literature, you know, and the courage that writers have always shown when, you know, without armies, without defenses, to stand up against tyranny. It's a thing that literature has always done.
And when the fatwa was issued, you were asked to take on a different identity which went to the core, the root of your person, which was choosing a different name. You know, a different name, and so the book now, your memoir, is called Joseph Anton, and you chose this name by looking to literature.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they told me not to choose an Indian name, which made it even worse, you know, to give up not only your name, but the ethnicity of your name. You know? And so I thought, well, if I can't have that country, I can have my other country, which is literature. And I fooled around with the names of different writers, combinations of the names of different writers, and most of them were really awful. You know,
some of them were funny.
Yeah, Marcel Beckett, you know. You know, Vladimir Joyce, you know.
Didn't really sound quite
didn't
right.
Sound right.
No.
You know, sounded like a writer making up a name, right? And eventually, I wrote down the first names of Conrad and Chekhov. And I thought that looks like that could exist. There could be such a person. And actually, there's also this sort of ridiculous thing that I had always wanted to write a book which had a person's name as the title. You know, David Copperfield. You know, Robinson Crusoe, Huckleberry Finn. You know, it's a wonderful way to name a book. Daniel Deronda, Silas Marner, Oliver Twist. These are books, you know. And I thought, I want one of those. I want one of those books.
And we have one.
Yeah, Tom Jones. I want one of those books, you know. I ended up getting it. It turned out not to be a novel, but to be nonfiction. And it turned out, the name turned out to be mine, you know, and that wasn't expected. But I did think about Conrad and Chekhov. And
why them?
Well, first of all, because the name sounded good when you put it together. But also, I thought Chekhov, you know, I was in a situation not unlike characters in Chekhov, you know, melancholy, isolated, yearning to be somewhere else, feeling that the things they valued had been cut down. You know, and I thought I was a sort of funny mixture of the Three Sisters and Madame Arkadina and all these characters. I felt, I don't know, I felt Chekhovian, you know, which I have not often felt, I should say, but I did at that moment. And
it's funny how Chekhovian is not as much a word as Kafkaesque.
No, but I think Kafka is the one, that the reason for that, I mean, Joycean, Proustian also not as much used, because Kafka's the one who dreamed the future. You know, he's the world we live in, I think, is more Kafka's world than Joyce's or Proust's or Chekhov's. You know, I mean, we live in the Kafka nightmare. We all wake up and discover that we're dung beetles. and nobody really cares about us. You know, we are all yearning to get towards a castle that will not answer our phone calls. And, you know, and in my case, I mean, the famous first line of the trial, you know, which begins, someone had been telling lies about Joseph K. I thought, yeah, I know what that feels like. You know? So yes, Kafka, but I couldn't find a good name that included France or Kafka, you know. You know, Franz Steinbeck, not so good. Anyway, so, and Conrad, because I mean, I remembered that years earlier I had, when my great friend Edward Said, the great Palestinian intellectual, taught at Columbia, Edward and I had been talking about his battle against his illness, you know, his long battle against cancer. And he, of course, Edward was a great scholar of Conrad, written about Conrad. And the line in Conrad that he talked to me about was this line from The Nigger of the Narcissus, in which the sailor who's dying of tuberculosis, you know, on board the Narcissus, the ship, is approached by one of his shipmates. And the shipmate says to him, you know, why do you get on the ship? You knew you were sick. You knew you were sick, and if you're sick, why don't you stay home? Why do you get on the ship? And he says this famous line. He says, "I must live till I die, mustn't I?"
What does the line mean?
It means that. It means you live. You continue to live. You don't stop. You live until you die. And Edward very much put that into practice. He went on writing. He went on lecturing. He went on teaching. He went on being Edward Said. He didn't stop being himself and instead just become the illness. He remained himself until more or less the moment that he died. I mean, you could say the same of Christopher Hitchens, for instance. I thought, I don't know when this is coming, and I hope it's not soon, but you must live until you die. And that's the job I set myself. Hence, Joseph Anton.
I'd like us to look at another image from the archives, a doodle, and I'd like you to read it. You like doodling.
Yeah. This is the most embarrassing thing about archives, that stuff that you never dreamed was going to be projected on a screen at the New York Public Library.
Why on earth did you give it?
Because I'm an idiot. That's why. I have no idea what this means. This is a piece of...
Let's discover it together.
Well, I mean, it's got a text underneath it.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the picture has to do with it at all.
It's words I'd like you to read.
Oops, sorry. Excuse me. I'm not used to being Lady Gaga. This is the 14th of June, 1989, so it's actually 2 days after that other text. All I want to do is to stay alive, work, and have my work appreciated instead of distorted and maligned, but I now fear that will never be possible. I mean, a lot of this was one of the reasons I started keeping this journal. A lot of it was to do with just venting. It was a point when I was very isolated. I couldn't see many people, and also there's a limit to how much you can bleat at people about how badly you feel. So pouring it out onto pieces of paper was just a way of dealing with it. But I never remotely thought that anybody else would see it. It was just kind of autotherapy, if you like. That's it. I have no more to say on that. I'd like you to take us back to that, what you call the unfunny Valentine. Yeah.
That moment.
February the 14th, 1989. Well, it did sort of come out of the blue because, there had been an argument going on about the book. And there was a part of me that didn't mind the argument.
What was the argument?
Well, I think that one of the things that literature can do is to start interesting arguments. One of the things it can do is to look at stuff, make people look in the face at things they may not particularly wish to look in the face of, and start a debate, which can be, it can be a heated debate. It can be one in which people have strong opinions, and so on. All that's fair enough, and I think it's one of the things that books can offer to a culture. Let's talk about this. What, you don't like it? Tell me why you don't like it. You have the argument, and in the course of the argument, maybe everybody learns a little something, and then the argument's over, and you proceed, and there's the next argument. And I thought that wasn't so bad, and that was sort of what was happening until that day. And then, out of the blue, really, the Ayatollah Khomeini jumped into the argument and changed the subject. Because at that point, the subject stopped being the text of the book, and whether it was saying something true or false, and whether you liked the way it was saying it or didn't like it, or, that kind of argument. And it became instead, the subject became murder and terrorism, and how was one to deal with that? You know?
And the subject became that in part because the book wasn't read.
Well, of
I
course
mean,
the book-
you in that passage I had you read, you already mention reader.
Yeah, because, you know, almost all the people who initially attacked it had not, you know, they were clean of the actual.
They were open-minded
They
because
didn't
they
dirty
hadn't...
their hands with the actual text. You know, they simply formed an opinion about it without needing to open the book. There was one of the Indian MPs who started the whole thing going by demanding that the book be banned in India. When he was asked why he hadn't read it, he said that he didn't need to wade in the gutter to know that it contained filth. I thought, good point. You know, good point about gutters. But that was the kind of attitude. We know, you know, we haven't read it because we don't like it, and we don't like it because we haven't read it. That was very much the spirit of those times. And
the book was taken away from where it belonged,
Yeah.
namely in a literary or philosophical
it was taken away from
sphere.
the world of books. And for a long time, I felt frustrated that almost the only language that couldn't be used to talk about the book was the language of books. You know, you could use the language of literature seemed almost self-indulgent if you were talking about this particular book. The discourse was, there was a political discourse or a sociological discourse or a theological discourse, or there were all these different kinds of speech that seemed appropriate when discussing this book. And the only speech that didn't seem appropriate was the normal speech in which books are discussed. And so, yeah, it was badly damaged by that. And people formed opinions about it based on, you know, falsifications and gossip and hearsay and so on. And in many ways, I felt that the book that was being discussed didn't exist. It literally didn't exist. I mean, afterwards, I had all sorts of people writing to me in the years that followed, saying, well, we read your book and we can't see what the problem, where's the difficult bit, where's the problem? You know, and I even had some people who had been Muslim protesters against the book saying, well, then we read your book and we couldn't see what the fuss was about. And I thought, yes, asshole, but you were the person making the fuss.
And you didn't, I mean, Salman, you didn't invent the satanic verses.
No, I mean, it's a well-recorded historical story that's in many of the more reputable so-called traditions of the Prophet, the hadiths, as they're called. And I first learned about them when studying history at Cambridge. And
you had a wonderful teacher there.
a wonderful teacher called Arthur Hibbert, who was a brilliant medievalist and was a likable guy, who became a great mentor to me. And
you actually put him in the position of becoming a mentor in some way because you asked him to supervise.
Yeah.
us.
Well, he was the most brilliant historian that I met at Cambridge, and it was an incredible privilege to be supervised by him. And I mean, one of the more remarkable things that happened this year is that the BBC made this film about my life to go with this memoir, and actually went out in England last night on the BBC. And one of the things we discovered was that Arthur was still alive. I mean, I imagined he was long gone, you know, but we discovered that he was still alive and in his 90s, and living in a tiny little house still in Cambridge, although no longer anything to do with the university. And I went to see him. And I mean, I hadn't seen him since 1968. I hadn't seen him since I was 21 years old. It was the most moving moment, I think, for me, certainly. And I mean, I think he remembered me, which was actually shocking. And he remembered, well, I know that he'd read about me in the papers, but he actually remembered teaching me. And it was one of those moments, you know how you can have a great teacher who just says something to you, which sticks with you all your life and helps you. And most of us don't have the good fortune to meet that teacher later in life and say, here's what you gave me. You know? And Arthur, I remember teaching me history, said this thing. He said, you should never write history until you can hear the people speak. He said, if you can't hear them speak, you don't know enough about them and you can't tell their story. And great advice for a historian, but I thought also great advice for a novelist. When you know how people speak, you know a lot about them. You know, are they loquacious? Do they use bad language? Are they inarticulate? You know, once you've found that out about the character, how does it speak? You know a lot about the person. You know, and so it was extraordinary advice, and I've never forgotten it. And I was able this year, you know, no longer 21 but 65, going to see my old teacher now in his 90s and say, you know, you gave me this gift. And he said, oh yes, I remember that thought.
And you know, it struck me that thought is so consonant with what one of the great French historians again in the 19th century said. Michelet said that the goal, the role of the historians is to make the silences of history speak.
Well, this has been one of the great shifts in history, isn't it? The shift from political history to social history. You know, the idea that history is not about kings and battles, but it's about how people lived their lives and how the way they lived their lives was affected by the great events of the time and how what they felt and thought shaped the societies in which they lived. I mean, it comes out of the Marxist interpretation of history and it goes through towards people like Michelet. And I mean, actually a lot of these, right, the great historians of this were French.
French,
yeah.
Baudelaire.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the thing that I took away from Cambridge, and along with that, I took away the story of the Satanic Verses. You know, and I remember when I learned about this temptation of the prophet anecdote, basically, that the prophet is asked to consider the possibility that these three popular pagan goddesses in Mecca might be admitted into the pantheon. Not at the same level as Allah, but at the level of the angels. You know, he already had winged creatures. Why not three more who happened to be popular? And that was some kind of attempt to offer him an accommodation, you know. But it also required, of course, a compromise with monotheism. And it seems, I mean, the historical record is inexact, and there's a lot of conjecture in this. But it seems as if he flirted with it and then rejected it. He first brought these verses which seemed to accept these three goddesses, and then at a later point repudiated them, said that he had been deceived, that the devil had appeared to him in the guise of the archangel, and the verses were therefore not angelic but satanic, and they should be expunged from the Quran, and they were. So I mean, I remember hearing all this and thinking, you know, good story.
Yeah, read that little passage here.
Which one?
Just this tiny little passage from the book.
Yeah. Good story, he thought when he read about it. Even then he was dreaming of being a writer, and he filed the good story away in the back of his mind for future consideration. 20 years later, he would find out exactly how good a story it was. This is one of the sad things about our time, is that people don't know their own history and their own tradition. You know, that's to say, this particular episode exists inside the Islamic tradition. It's not outside it. It exists inside it. It's in at least 4 of the many hadiths, the traditions of the Prophet, the stories and anecdotes of the life of the Prophet that have survived. In some of them very authoritative, like the hadiths of Tabari, for example. Al-Tabari is one of the most highly respected of these collections, and it openly tells this story. So the strange thing, of course, is that most people in the Muslim world now don't know their own tradition. You know, they've been fed a kind of simplified and brutalized version of Islamic tradition, and their own stories they don't know. And if they were better informed of their own tradition, they would have known that this story exists within it, and therefore
you didn't invent it.
No, so nothing wrong is being done by referring to something that already exists in the tradition. But they didn't know that, and they were encouraged not to know it, and hence there was a bit of trouble. You may have heard about that.
I'm always surprised after 3 decades of living in this country that when we want to speak about something irrelevant in the English language, we say that's history.
Well, you know, I mean, for me, I think the study of history was essential. I mean, the most important thing in terms of the kind of writer I eventually became.
Because one might ask you, you know, what the influences were upon your work, and there are many.
Yeah,
but history.
Well, everybody talks about me as kind of, you know, magic realism, fantasy,
Right.
etc. That wasn't it. The bedrock thing was always the study of history, because history is about how human beings live in their time. You know, history is about how the great events of our age shape our lives, and it asks the question whether we are able, in our turn, to shape the great events. You know, that's to say, what is the relationship between society and the individual? You know, do we make history, or does it just unmake us? So, and those questions which historians always wrestle with are also the questions I've tried to look at as a writer. You know, I think a lot of my books are deeply rooted in history: the independence of India, the Renaissance, the Mughal Empire.
I mean, last time we spoke, we spoke about Machiavelli.
Yeah, exactly. So I think for me, it's just been essential, you know, the historical method more than history, trying to understand how events shape people, how people shape events. You know, trying to find stories to tell about that.
And it wasn't obvious, because you might have ended up going to Cambridge and studying economics.
Yeah.
I love that story.
Yeah, no, my father was not very much in tune with the arts, which he felt were, you know, an interesting hobby, but nothing that you're going to waste your time studying. So, I mean, I got a minor scholarship, an exhibition to go to King's and read history, and he ordered me to change. When I got to Cambridge, he said, "You've got to change and study economics," which felt to me like something close to a death sentence, actually. And I got there, and I went to see the senior tutor, and I said, "Look, you know, my father says I can't study history, and I've got to study economics." And he said, "Yeah, but what do you say?" And I said, "Well, I don't want to study economics. You know, I got in here to study history. I want to study history." And he said, He said, "Okay." He said, "Leave it with me." And then he wrote my father a letter which said, "Dear Mr. Rushdie, your son has informed me of his desire to switch to read economics. It is our belief, it's the belief of the college, that he is not qualified to study economics. And if he insists on doing so, I must ask you to remove him from the university so that the place can be made available for somebody who can actually study what they're going to study." And my father just shut the fuck up. Yeah. He just never mentioned it again.
So the letter went unanswered.
And so I've always, you know, always been very grateful to that particular professor for that. He saved my life.
After that unfunny Valentine Day, one of the elements that came so strongly to the foreground for you was just and it's one of the words you choose in the 7 words, is friendship.
Yeah.
Is the friends who booksellers were part of a friendly community or courageous community, but they were individuals.
Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking in particular, but you might mention them just as well, but I'm thinking as your your relationship with Penn is so strong, Susan Sontag, and of course Christopher Hitchens, Paul Auster, and many others who just kept you, as literature has kept you alive, these friends did.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very big theme of this book is the way in which I was helped by the love of my friends. I mean, I know, Susan Sontag was a great friend, and immediately after, the excrement hit the ventilation system, she went into battle, and she was calling up every writer in America and rallying them, and some of them didn't particularly want to be rallied, by the way. There was a certain amount of discovering previous engagements, but Susan wasn't letting them do that. She whipped everybody into line, Norman Mailer, Arthur Miller, everybody, both of whom were a little wobbly.
What do you mean?
Well, do I really want to? Maybe it won't be so good if I do it because, I'm Jewish and they won't like that. There was some of that. There was a little sort of shuffling for the exit that went on. But Susan just made them discover their best selves, and within a couple of days, they all did. And then there was this extraordinary collective act of defense by the world's writers, and Susan was very important in rallying American writers. So that was one thing, but it wasn't just that public area, In fact, the thing that is the reason why I'm sitting here talking to you and not completely, destroyed by the experience is because of this group of very close friends of mine, mainly in England initially, who just looked after me, who went to enormous lengths to make sure I was okay and to support me, emotionally, practically, in all sorts of ways. I remember my friend Bill Buford, the writer Bill Buford, who was then editing Granta. He's an American in England at the time. He was editing Granta magazine and then subsequently became the literary editor of the New Yorker for a while. And Bill said to me this line that I've never forgot. He said, your friends are going to form an iron circle around you, and you're going to be able to live inside the circle. And that's what they did. And they kept every secret.
Which is rare for writers.
This is, writers, for goodness sake. You can't keep a secret to save their lives, but they all kept secrets to save mine, and they were discreet and loyal and courageous, sort of unafraid, and extraordinary. People were moving out of their homes so that I could live in them. People did just quite remarkable things, and for more than 20 years, I haven't told that story. And one of the things that I felt really happy about writing this book was to finally be able to say, these are the people who did it. Look what they did. Look what they did, these people. And people would ask me in those days whether people were frightened to be associated with me. Did people kind of edge away because they didn't want to be endangered by association? And the truth is that the exact opposite happened. That the people who cared about, they actually stepped closer. They said, what can we do? They stepped closer. And even people who had not been my closest friends, like, for example, Christopher Hitchens. I mean, Christopher was somebody that I knew, and he was a friend of Martin Amos's, he was a friend of other friends of mine, James Fenton's, he was a friend of, Ian McEwan's, all of whom I knew better than I knew him, because he was living in DC and I was living in England, and I didn't see him that much. I mean, I was fond of him, but I wasn't close to him. When this started, he took the very deliberate, immediate decision to come and stand shoulder to shoulder, right next to me, and because he cared about the principles involved. He said, as I would also say, that in this battle, everything he hated was fighting against everything he loved, and so of course he wanted to be. Christopher liked battles. you know. Christopher was a brawler. And if you happen to be in a brawl, you want Christopher on your side. And he just made himself one of my closest friends because of the danger I was in. And so that's what happened. People came closer, not further away. And so oddly, in this period when there was all this animosity and hatred, you know, being leveled in my direction, what I actually remember from that period more than that is this. I remember friendship and love as being the thing that I take away from it.
And yet you also mention in your memoir some incredible disappointments.
Yeah.
People who did not take a stand, and you would have imagined. I was particularly struck by one.
Oh yeah, which one?
John Berger.
Yes.
I didn't know this, and he's someone I dearly admire, as I think to some extent.
I mean, I knew Berger. You know, I'd known Berger before any of this, and I always thought, I mean, I admired him. Didn't particularly admire his fiction, I have to say, but I admired his mind, you know, and
ways of seeing.
Yes, his non-fiction, his essays, I admired immensely, you know. And we'd met, and I thought we were on perfectly friendly terms, you know. And then, I mean, I remember this early. It was quite early on. I mean, after the trouble began, I was sitting in some damp cottage in mid-Wales, and it was inevitably raining, which is, you don't even have to say that when you just have to say mid-Wales. The rest follows. And the police came in with the newspapers for me, because I'd asked them to go and get me some. And it was the Guardian, and on the top, you know, the front page at the top, it sort of flagged that inside there was an article by Berger about this, about me. And I thought, oh, good. And assuming that it would be supportive, you know, and turned to it, and was really shocked to discover that he was so hostile, and was accusing me of, you know, opportunism and this and that, and saying that, you know, because of the religious sensibilities involved, I should withdraw the book, essentially. And I thought, this is a Marxist intellectual. You know, this is of all the people who's, you know, spent his life outside the world of religious belief, you know, suddenly is sympathizing with it. And
how do you explain it?
I can't explain it. And the interesting thing is that so many, we have a lot of friends in common, John Berger and I, and many people have asked him, you know, what the hell do you think you were doing? And he refuses to talk about it. He's never talked about it. He's always.
Is it the same with John Le Carré and others?
With John, with John Le Carré, I think there was a problem, which is I'd given one of his books a bad review.
So it was payback time.
I had reviewed his novel, The Russia House, and you know, and I'm an admirer of John Le Carré, by the way, and I had spent probably half the review saying how much I admired many of his books, saying,
and the other half,
and the other half saying that this one not so much, you know. I think I used the term "close but no cigar." he didn't like it. I mean, I wouldn't have liked it, you know. Maybe it came from that. But the thing that I mean, I think in a way I regret the quarrel. I think we both got rather carried away. Carried away. And you know, he said something rude, I said something ruder, he said something ruder than that, I said something ruder than that. Then Christopher jumped in and made it 100 times as rude. And then there was some more rudery from him and me. And I sort of wish we hadn't done it, really. I think we both just got overheated. But there was one thing that he said that I thought was important to take issue with, where he basically said that if you attack a known enemy, You know what they're like. And then they respond by attacking you. You shouldn't cry foul. It's, you've done that and you knew what they were like, and if they come after you, well, you shouldn't be surprised. And I thought, well, that really dismisses what we were talking about earlier, the entire history of literature. One of the most majestic things about literature is the way in which writers have gone up against known enemies, the way in which they have confronted tyrants. Mandelstam knew what Stalin was like. It didn't stop him writing his poem. Lorca knew what Franco was like. The poets have always known, writers have always known what they're taking on, and yet they have taken it on. And it's actually one of the things that makes you most proud to be a member of this profession, that's happened. And that John le Carré was saying that was improper behavior, if you like, seemed to me to denigrate something very important about literature. That I think was an argument that we could have had. Maybe we could have had it in more temperate language.
I'm curious whether over all these years by writing this memoir, in a way you are revisiting, remembering friendships and able to speak about them.
Yeah.
And you're remembering, revisiting animosities and able to revisit those. Have you come across any of those enemies who wrote poorly about you? And what would you do if you saw them on the street, and would you forgive them?
I'll let you know. The book only came out the day before yesterday. So I think there's probably a lot of people reading through it trying to say, where's the bit about me, But the truth is, I actually, however it may seem, I really didn't write the book to get even. I didn't write the book as an exercise in score settling. And in fact, I went to some lengths, I thought, in the book, that even when there were people who I had been disappointed by, that I should at least make an effort to try and stand in their shoes and try and see their behavior from their point of view. And I do think the book does make an effort to do that. Whether people notice that or not is another matter.
And it makes an effort also to talk about people in very, very high, prominent places who helped.
Yeah.
Whether it is Václav Havel or Bill Clinton or others. Yeah. I'd like you to tell one of those stories. Well, maybe Havel, I was going to say, because Havel is an incredible story.
Well, this was, after all, one of the other things that happened in 1989 was a little something in Eastern Europe, like the fall of the Iron Curtain and the liberation of these societies. And Havel became president of what was then still called Czechoslovakia before the split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And the first state visit he made after becoming president was to England. And I didn't know him. I didn't know him at all, but he was friendly with my friend, the British playwright Harold Pinter. And Harold had known him for a long time. And he wrote to Harold and said that he wanted to make a big gesture of support for me on this visit, and he would like to arrange a big public meeting, where he and I would be on a stage together, and he would make a speech, etc. I mean, I was, of course, very moved by this and said I would love that to happen. And then, to put it bluntly, the British government felt embarrassed that the president of the Czech Republic was taking a more vociferous position than they were. And they made it very difficult. They basically created a situation in which it was very difficult for us to meet. And they said, well, if he really wants to meet you, he can meet you in the Czech embassy. And Havel said, I'm not going in the Czech embassy. He said, we haven't been able to clean that place out yet. And he said, I don't trust it. So he wouldn't go in the Czech embassy, and he was the president. And the British wouldn't make it possible for us to meet anywhere else. So in the end, we weren't able to do this, and we just ended up having a phone conversation. And he gave me a phone number, and I was supposed to call this at a certain time. So I called the number, and the voice answers the phone, and I said, is this President Havel? And the voice giggled and said, no, it's not the president. And I said, well, this is my name, and I was asked to call this number at this time, and could I speak to the president? And the voice said, no, you wait, please. And then I heard the phone being put down, and sort of like in a bad movie, footsteps going away. And then footsteps coming back. And the phone picked up the same person on the phone who said, no, you see, the president is on the toilet. And I thought, oh, there really has been a revolution in Czechoslovakia. So anyway, eventually, the president came to the phone. And he was very sweet. He said how upset he was that the meeting had not been made possible. And he said, but I gave a press conference today, and I told them total support. I said, oh, really? He said, yes. I said, total support. And I tell them we are in complete contact. And I said, oh, well, that's great. I said, I hope we will be. And he said, yes. I said, complete contact. And I thought that's kind of great. So fast forward a number of years, and I was finally able to make a visit to Prague, and he invited me to meet him in the castle. And when I got there, I was led through all these corridors, very grand corridors, into his room, and he wasn't there because he was late, and they said, you wait here, and then they left me. So I'm alone in the room of the President of the Czech Republic. I could have done anything, If I'd been a rock star, I could have trashed it, Anyway, I'm standing there, and I go over to the window, and I look down, and there's this path coming up from the hill that comes up to the main square, where the castle stands. And I see Havel and his wife, hand in hand, walking up the path. So I lean out of, his office window and wave. As if I'm the queen, And there's Havel looking up with his wife, and he sees me leaning out of his window, going, and he kind of completely cracked up. And I mean, it kind of broke the ice. That was the first time we met, when I waved to him from his presidential window. And then, he was very supportive, and I told him, which was true, that one of the books that I'd read that had been very helpful to me was his book, The Letters to Olga, which were his prison letters, and which he wrote to his then wife, his first wife. And he said, yes, he said, this book, many of the passages are written, in code. We had to write in code. He said, the problem is that in some cases I do not remember the code. He said, so I do not know what they mean. I said, well, I thought they were good. So, yeah, he was, he was essentially always, he was really a writer who happened to take on the job of being president because he thought it was necessary, but his temperament was that of a playwright, not just a playwright, but an absurdist playwright. So I've always thought one of the things I loved that he did when he became president was that, there had been all these sort of Soviet-era motorcades of huge, ugly, black Zeal automobiles, and he decided they should all be painted different colors. So the presidential motorcades became like Technicolor. And that was just to show that there'd been a change.
I'm struck in your telling of the story that you bring up when you make that call movies. And movies is one of the 7 words you've chosen.
Yeah.
And the grammar of movies, movies in general have had a great importance on you, but I'm curious to what extent they influenced your writing.
I think quite a bit. And
it comes up again and again.
Yeah, I grew up in a movie town. And if you grow up in Bombay, Bombay is like New York and Los Angeles combined. It's like as if the movie industry was in New York, that would be Bombay. And I grew up with members of my family involved. I mean, I had an uncle who was a screenwriter. I had two of my aunts, one of whom was a dancer, one of whom was an actress, who were involved in the movies a little bit. And so it was everywhere, you know. And also, you walk around, you go around Bombay, you see movies being made all over the place. You know, it's part of daily life. So, also when I was a kid, less so than now, there were movie theaters in Bombay that had close ties to American movie studios. So you would get first-run American films really very soon, as well as, of course, all the Indian films. And there's some of these theaters still there, but they don't seem to work in that way. There's a cinema called the Metro, which, you know, was affiliated to MGM, and there's a cinema called the Eros, which had a deal with Paramount, and there was a cinema called the Regal, which had a deal with Universal International, and the New Empire, which was 20th Century Fox, and so on. So we were seeing a lot of new American films as well as all the local films, and so, you know, the movies were very much an important thing. And then do you
think they in some way inform the writing of this memoir?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, well, one of the sort of orchestrating ideas of this memoir is a metaphor taken from Hitchcock's movie The Birds.
The Birds, which is an image that haunts you.
Yeah, and well, also Daphne du Maurier's story, but more the Hitchcock movie, really, because I came to feel that what happened to me is that, I mean, it's the title of the first part of the book is that I became the first blackbird. You know, there's this scene in The Birds where there's a teacher in a classroom leading little kids in a roundelay, in a song, and Hitchcock watches them in the classroom, and he cuts outside to the playground where there's a climbing frame, some jungle gym thing, and you hear the children singing all the time. You know? And he cuts out to the playground, and you see one bird land on the climbing frame. And he cuts inside, and there's the children singing. And he cuts outside, and now there's 6 birds on the climbing frame. He cuts back inside, and there's children singing. He cuts back out, and there's hundreds of birds. And it's a very scary moment. And I thought, you know, when it's just one bird sitting there, you don't have to draw any conclusions from it. It's just a bird sitting on a climbing frame. You know, you don't have to assume that something awful is coming your way. It's just a bird. And it's only afterwards, when there is the storm of the birds, when there's the attack of the birds, that you think, oh yeah, there was that first bird. You know? And I think that's what happened. That's what happened to the attack on the Satanic Verses, was the first bird. And you can draw from that a line to the 9/11 attacks and beyond, to what's happening now.
How so?
Well, because the phenomenon that was beginning then, which is partly just the growth of Islamic radicalism and the ease with which it would move into what Anthony Burgess in Clockwork Orange calls the old ultraviolence. That phenomenon, of course, became much bigger after the attack on my book. Also, the way in which the attack on my book was essentially organized. You know, it was a kind of manufactured outrage. We now see how good people have become at manufacturing outrage. We see that, you know, this week and last week. And so I think what happened is that when it happened to me in my book, nobody had a context for it. Nobody understood the frame that it was in. And so it was bewildering to people. People, what the hell is this? You know, where did this come from? Seems crazy.
And bewildering to you, I mean.
And yeah, but all of us, we didn't have a way, it wasn't part of a story. We didn't know what it seemed like a weird event out of nowhere on its own. And then, I mean, probably, let's say to be simple, on September 11, 2001, the thing that had just been my little story became the story of the city. It became everyone's story, you know. And I think at that point, a lot of people could look back at this event much before and see that these things were connected, you know. I mean, I had several journalist friends, American journalists, I mean, quite senior journalists, saying to me in the weeks and months after the 9/11 attack, they said, oh, well, now we understand what happened to you. And I thought, really? You know, I mean, that's what it took. You know, why should it, all those people had to die?
All those birds.
All of those, you know, but then I thought, okay, yes, because now it's your story too. You know, now it's not my story, now it's your story. It's our story. You know, we're all in that story. And yeah, and I mean, that's one of the, yes, so I use talk about movies, I use the imagery of the Hitchcock movie as a way of trying to explain that.
What does living in New York afford you?
I don't know, I like it. You know, I mean, as we say, what's not to like? I annoyed somebody today by saying I like going to Yankee Stadium. Turned out to be a Mets fan. You know, poor man. But, you know, I've always loved New York. I came to New York when I was 26 years old for the first time. And I've always had a lot of friends here. I've always loved being here. And I always had this itch to come and just put myself here and see what happened. You know, I mean, long before any of this trouble began, I thought, you know, I was attracted to the place. And finally, and then what happened in these bad years is that the United States allowed me to come here for periods of time, which started off being like a week or 10 days and extended to be several months, where I could actually come here and get out of the trap. You know, they would allow me to come and just make my own choices, you know, rent an apartment, rent a house in the countryside, just live. And for me, it became, you know, coming to America in those years, I mean, I talk about it in the book, how it felt like exhilarating because I was escaping from the bubble, you know, and suddenly instead of being surrounded by, you know, stuck in an armored car and surrounded by armed men, I was able to walk the streets and drive my own car and lead an ordinary life, you know. And for me, it was the way of beginning to recapture liberty, you know. And I think one of the reasons why, when things got easier, I decided that I would settle here, you know, was the memory of the fact that this is where I got it back. This is where I got back the life that I wanted.
And you feel that the readers who didn't, I mean, there are two kinds of readers of the Satanic Verses, those who are against it and who lack humor, and those who understand it and are humorous. The role of humor is so important in your work. And
yeah, it doesn't, not many people say that it's a funny book. You know, it's not one of the most heard remarks about the Satanic Verses, but actually it is a funny book. And I think what is the thing that happened to it was so not funny that people assumed that it must have the characteristics of the attack against it. That, you know, because the attack was not funny, it couldn't be funny. Because the attack was kind of weird and arcane and incomprehensible, the book must be weird and arcane and incomprehensible, you know. And suddenly the book had imposed upon it the qualities of the attack against the book. But actually, when people read it, they always say to me, you know, it's really funny, as if it was almost improper that it should be really funny.
You know, just before I have you do a final reading for us, I was struck by a comparison I might want to make between what Milan Kundera says about the novel and what you just said now about humor in the novel. Kundera says, but what but what is that wisdom that is the novel? There is a fine Jewish proverb, man thinks, God laughs. Inspired by that adage, I like to imagine that François Rabelais heard God's laughter one day, and thus was born the idea of the first great European novel. It pleases me to think that the art of the novel came into the world as an echo of God's laughter. And a bit later he says, François Rabelais invented a number of neologisms that have since entered the French and other languages, but one of his words has been forgotten, and this is regrettable. It is the word agélast. It comes from the Greek and it means a man who does not laugh, who has no sense of humor. Rabelais detested the agélasts. He feared them. He complained that the agélasts treated him so atrociously that he nearly stopped writing forever. No peace is possible between the novelist and the agélast. Never having heard God's laughter, the agélasts are convinced that the truth is obvious, that all men necessarily think the same thing, and that they themselves are exactly what they think they are. But it is precisely in losing the certainty of truth and the unanimous agreement of others that man becomes an individual. The novel is an imaginary paradise of individuals. It is a territory where no one possesses the truth, neither Anna nor Karenin, but where everyone has the right to be understood, both Anna and Karenin.
Oh. I mean, it's a wonderful essay, that. It also reminds me of an essay that the German Nobel laureate Heinrich Böll wrote about laughter, in which he says that the Latin word humor means moisture or dampness. And he said that humor is the way of seeing with an eye that is neither completely dry nor completely wet.
Fantastic.
Neither completely, cynical nor completely sentimental, but damp. Through that dampness comes humor. And I think it's a beautiful idea. Language reveals great truth. Look at the meaning of words, and you learn enormous amounts about. You look at the etymology of words,
including your very name. So I want to, we began by talking about the name that you chose for yourself, for protection.
Yeah.
Now I would like to circle back to your real name, as it came to you through your father.
Through my father, yeah.
And read a passage from the book. But just before we do that, I'd like us to listen to the voice of Philip Larkin.
This be the verse. They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had, and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids yourself.
Salman, if you could, after that reading, read this passage to us.
Can I just say, that poem, people don't know why it's called This Be the Verse.
I don't.
It comes from a poem that Robert Louis Stevenson wrote, he wrote it as his epitaph for himself. Hang on, I'll try and do this. Under the bright and cloudless sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Gladly I lived and gladly died, and I laid me down with a will. This be the verse you grave for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the hunter, home from the sea. Home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter, home from the hill. That's where this be the verse comes from. And actually, Stevenson's grave, which is in the South Seas, that's what's on his gravestone. So oddly, it's a verse which refers to death. And Larkin gloomily uses it to refer to parents.
In closing, let's have you read about your father.
Yeah, well, from where? From down here?
Yeah. From there to there.
All right. Yes.
This will give the public here, a sense also.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's one of the things I really am happy about in this book, that I was able to make this portrait of my father, and this is a bit of it. When he graduated from Cambridge, the book's written in the third person, so the he is me. When he graduated from Cambridge University and told his father he wanted to be a writer, a pained yelp burst uncontrollably out of Anis's mouth. "What," he cried, "am I going to tell my friends?" But 19 years later, on his son's 40th birthday, Anis Rushdie sent him a letter written in his own hand that became the most precious communication that writer had ever received or would receive. This was just 5 months before Anis's death at 77 of rapidly advancing multiple myeloma, cancer of the bone marrow. In that letter, Anis showed how carefully and deeply he had read and understood his son's books, how eagerly he looked forward to reading more of them, and how profoundly he felt the fatherly love he had spent half a lifetime failing to express. He lived long enough to be happy at the success of Midnight's Children and Shame, but by the time the book that owed the greatest debt to him was published, he was no longer there to read it. Perhaps that was a good thing, because he also missed the furore that followed. Although one of the few things of which his son was utterly certain was that in the battle over the Satanic Verses, he would have had his father's unqualified, unyielding support. Without his father's ideas and example to inspire him, in fact, that novel would never have been written. They fuck you up, your mum and dad. No, that wasn't it at all. Well, they did do that, perhaps, but they also allowed you to become the person and the writer that you had it in you to be. The first gift he received from his father, a gift like a message in a time capsule, which he didn't understand till he was an adult, was the family name. Rushdie was Anis's invention. His father's name had been quite a mouthful, Khwaja Muhammaddin Khaliki Dehlvi, a fine old Delhi name that sat well on that old-school gentleman glaring fiercely out of his only surviving photograph, that successful industrialist and part-time essayist who lived in a crumbling Haveli in the famous old neighborhood of Ballimara, a warren of small winding lanes off Chandni Chowk in Delhi that had been the home of the great Farsi and Urdu poet Ghalib. Muhammaddin Khaliki died young, leaving his son a fortune which he would squander, and a name that was too heavy to carry around in the modern world. Anis renamed himself Rushdie because of his admiration for Ibn Rushd, Averroes to the west, the 12th century Spanish-Arab philosopher of Cordoba, who rose to become the Qadi or judge of Seville, the translator of and acclaimed commentator upon the works of Aristotle. His son bore the name for 2 decades before he understood that his father, a true scholar of Islam who was also entirely lacking in religious belief, had chosen it because he respected Ibn Rushd for being at the forefront of the rationalist argument against Islamic literalism in his time. And 20 more years elapsed before the battle over the Satanic Verses provided the 20th century echo of that 800-year-old argument. At least, he told himself when the storm broke over his head, I'm going into this battle bearing the right name. From beyond the grave, his father had given him the flag under which he was ready to fight, the flag of Ibn Rushd, which stood for intellect, argument, analysis, and progress, for the freedom of philosophy and learning from the shackles of theology, for human reason and against blind faith, submission, acceptance, and stagnation. Nobody ever wanted to go to war, but if a war came your way, it might as well be the right war, about the most important things in the world. And you might as well, if you were going to fight it, be called Rushdie and stand where your father had placed you, in the tradition of the grand Aristotelian Averroes, Abul Walid, Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd. They had the same voice, his father and he. When he answered the telephone at home, Anis's friends would begin to talk to him as if he were his father, and he would have to stop them before they said anything embarrassing. They looked like each other, and when during the smoother passages of their bumpy journey as father and son, they sat on a veranda in a warm evening with the scent of bougainvillea in their nostrils and argued passionately about the world, they both knew that although they disagreed on many topics, they had the same cast of mind. And what they shared, above all else, was unbelief.
Salman Rushdie, thank you very much.
Thank you.